Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is our continuing series of 10 questions in our Great Big History podcast. We're up to World War II. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. So, in our continuing series of very hard to do, very hard to get through lectures, we now have World War II and the early Cold War. So, what rhetoric caused World War II? And it's fascism's conservative rhetoric, the must return to pre-World War I greatness. The inability of fascism to live with liberalism, especially communism. The idea that the libs are enemies everywhere. Inside Germany, inside Italy, inside Europe, inside the United States. That there are enemies everywhere wanting to destroy the national greatness. So what economics caused World War II? Well, fascism's need to loot for its militarism. While the United States did Keynesian economics, and Britain and France tried to use traditional rugged individualism for at least a while, and then eventually gave in to the Keynesian economics of the state needs to spend. Fascism right from the beginning, fascism especially in Germany, but it's also in Italy and Japan, right from the beginning spent money on the military. Germany's military budget increased from 1% of its GDP, gross domestic product, to 10%. German military spending was 3 times its Keynesian spending. So famously, you'll get this, that people say Hitler couldn't build anything, and they go, well, he built the Autobahn. He built all these highways. German military spending was 3 times the spending on all of those kind of infrastructure projects, all of those kind of unemployment projects, those kind of Keynesian ideas. And that raises a problem. Where are you going to get the money from? The German economy was hit harder than any place else. And so the question became, where does this come from? And Hitler's answer was looting. You loot your enemies. From 1933 to 1936 or so, it was inside Germany. The communists, the Jews, the liberals, the unionists, you attack them, you arrest them, and then you confiscate their property, their businesses, their bank accounts, and you sell them for pennies on the dollar. So that gets rich folk, that gets conservatives to be on your side. They see you as a thug, but now they own a factory that they didn't own before, and it was cheap to get. We see this in other what's called kleptocracies, whether it's Hungary, Orban's Hungary with the newspapers, or Putin's Russia with the oil and gas companies. Suddenly people who had no chance of being large industrialists suddenly own large factories that they got for pennies on the dollar from a company, from a bunch of people who are now in jail or have fled the country and disappeared. So you loot your enemies at home. And then in 37 and 38, you absorb new places. Austria, the Czechs, Czechoslovakia. In 39 came Poland. And with Poland came the start of the Second World War in Europe. Now in Asia, the Second World War actually starts earlier in 1937. And we'll see that the Japanese have the same problem as the Germans do and have the same solution. But in 1939, finally, the British and the French said no more We're going to have to fight. Germany can't be sated, can't be appeased. We're going to have to fight. And so that's the start of World War II in Europe with the conquest of Poland. Then in 1940, it's Western Europe, Netherlands and Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and then Northern France. And in 1941, the conquest of the Soviet Union, which was always the goal, the conquest of the defeat of the communists, the taking of all of this Eastern land. But the idea was that new wars paid for the old ones. And this is not a new idea in war. War is the most expensive things humans have ever done. And so new wars paid for the old ones. Napoleon worked this way. The Assyrians worked this way. If you took my History 101 class, right? Sargon worked this way. That the new wars paid for the old ones. But it's how a beaten economy, how a poor people can gain a giant empire. And that is, you have to keep winning. You have to keep winning and looting and winning and looting. The problem is that the more winning you do and the more looting you do, the more enemies you create. So why were the Germans so successful? Why? Why are they so successful? Well, at the start, before the Second World War becomes a shooting war, before September 1939, just nobody else was willing to fight. The only people, and this is a thing I cannot emphasize enough, because this gets caught up into appeasement, where people, and you'll hear it today with, Hitler, they went and appeased Hitler, but no, it was the First World War, man. It's not today. Nobody wanted to refight a First World War. Nobody. Not the conservatives, certainly not the liberals. Nobody wanted to fight that again. That's why you have isolationism in the United States, but appeasement in Britain and France. Stalin, who hates Hitler, and Hitler hates Stalin, and their systems are incompatible. Make a peace treaty in 1939 to divide up Eastern Europe. Stalin went to the capitalists and tried to get an alliance, and they were like, "Yeah, no, you're a communist." And so he went to the fascist and blew everybody's mind, because it's like, how can you people be friends? And they're like, they're not friends. Just Stalin would rather the fascists eat the capitalists first. But nobody was willing to fight. Nobody wanted to fight another First World War, which is how everyone thought it would be. Now, it turned up to be very different, a lot more mobile. It had the air forces. It had the tanks that are now much more mechanized. It was a much more oil-driven and energy-driven war than the First World War was. But that's not what anyone thought was going to happen. They thought it was going to be a new trenches in France and two sides murdering each other. And nobody wanted to do that. So I can't blame the British and the French for trying to avoid the war. You're going to fight? You're going to murder millions of people for the Czechs? For the Poles? For communists? Really? 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 The Germans, the Nazis, not even the Germans, the Nazis, because of their views on militarism, they were the only ones willing to fight. The second thing that made the Germans so successful was that conservatives liked fascism. It was better than communism. It was masculine. It was anti-feminism. It was anti-New Deal with all the Keynesian spending. It was anti-Semitic. It was anti-gay. And it was anti-black rights. And by black, I mean African Americans in the United States, but also Africans in the colonies, African migrants from the Caribbean or Africa. So it's black Caribbean or African migrants into Europe, which had, of course, been happening because of imperialism. So it was anti-black rights. Conservatives liked all that stuff in every country. So they were collaborators in every country. There were people who were willing. There were groups, not only individuals, but groups willing to work with the Nazis in every country. The most famous of which was Quisling in Norway. And it became a name. It became a slur. You're a Quisling. You're a collaborationist. But the Vichy France government did too. And the Vichy France government was made up of World War I veterans. But they thought of the liberals and the communists in France as worse than the fascists from Germany. The Dutch police and local governments worked with the Nazis. See Anne Frank's arrest. Anne Frank could not be arrested and exported without the assistance of local Dutch peoples. Father Coughlin in the United States had 30% of the adult listeners listening to him. And he was essentially pro-fascist. So today, Tucker Carlson gets about 1% of Americans. And he's considered to be like the most successful guy on Fox News. And he's the most conservative. And he's impacting the culture. But imagine how much more powerful Father Coughlin was. He reached 30% of adult listeners. The 1 out of 3 adults listened to his show. Tucker Carlson is 1%. Most people do not know what Tucker Carlson talks about, do not know who he is, and could care less. You could not avoid Father Coughlin in the 1930s. The UK, the United Kingdom, Britain, had 40 pro-Hitler MPs, and the ex-king, David Windsor, went and hung out with Hitler a couple times. Hoover, the president who lost to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who was president when the Great Depression began, met with Hitler in 1938 and said the words, "The world must look in admiration at the results achieved in Germany." That's 1938. Jews have been rounded up. They've been put in concentration camps. Communists are being shot. The military is being built. War is coming. 1938, we have Austria has been reabsorbed. Czechoslovakia is coming next. And then Hoover said the American, quote, liberal economic attitude made it impossible for the U.S. to build up such a successful organization as quickly as Germany. What's the liberal economic attitude? Keynesianism, FDR's New Deal. So you have the Republican president of the United States at the time of the Great Depression, from 1928 to 1932, saying the Nazis look good. Look at what they've done. We should be more like the Nazis. But oops, that New Deal, that liberal New Deal, will never get it done. In fact, Disney used Huey, Dewey, and Louie to make the Third Reich is all Reich with me. It was a cartoon lampooning all the people who actually liked the Nazis, who actually thought the Nazis weren't so bad, because they hated the same people they hated. The women, the New Deal, the Jews, the gays, the blacks. So one reason why the Germans were so successful was they were willing to fight when no one else was willing to fight. So they had the advantage of initiative. Also, there were lots of conservatives who would rather the fascists win than the communists. And they thought democracy was over. Democracy was too weak. It was too stupid. It was too fragile. It was too slow. Democratic capitalism couldn't win. So it was going to be fascism or communism. And if it was going to be one of those, conservatives are conservatives. So they picked fascism. And they did it in every country, even ones that were conquered by the Nazis. What about Italian and Spanish fascism? Because they're different. They just are. A relatively small number of Jews are murdered in Italy. Italian Jews are murdered in Italy. And I want to say the argument is most of them were after the Germans took over, but I could be wrong. but it was not a major part of Mussolini's fascism. Mussolini was anti-communist and pro-monarchy in a way, but there was not a massive. No, I mean I could just be wrong, but I think it's like 20 to 25% of Italian Jews are murdered, which is less than France. And Italy had a fascist government, and the French had a collaborationist one. And it's much less. Whatever it is in Italy is much less than what happened in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is 75%. So we'll talk about that later. But it's unreal how many of the Dutch Jews were exterminated. And the Dutch are supposed to be democratic capitalist people. So what the Italian and Spanish fascism was very anti-communist. Mussolini wanted a new Roman Empire, and so he invested in the Italian military, but Italian industrial power was a joke. It just, Hemingway called him the biggest bluff in Europe. He's like, he talks big, but he's just full of hot air. He can't do what he's talking about doing. He invaded Ethiopia. That was the second time the Italians had invaded Ethiopia. The first time was in the 1880s, and they were defeated. He invaded again. In theory, he conquered them. I mean, later on, he'll invade Albania, but he'll be defeated by the Greeks. I mean, it was Italian military industrial power was a joke. It was all hot air. The Italians had been traumatized by the First World War. Italian industrial power was Japan was probably ahead of them. They were probably the weakest of all the industrialized powers. It wasn't a serious argument. They didn't have the walk to back up the talk. Spanish fascism under Franco was obsessed with turning the clock back to the 1880s. It wanted to murder the communists, the liberals, and the gays. And so it wanted to reimpose a Catholic state without the monarchy. The monarchy had failed. That was the idea. The monarchy had given in to all the libs in the 20s and the 30s. The monarchy was too liberal, and so we needed a military man to run the country. And so Franco ran Spain as an authoritarian Catholic state after the Spanish Civil War. The idea was that conservative Catholic landowners versus the liberal secular land redistributionists. And there's a very powerful scene in Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is the communists / liberals murdering the landowners in a town, and how it happens, and how you get from a petty argument between a land renter and the land owner, that the land renter had been abused by the landowner. The landowner had upped the fees, had stolen some of his crops, he had abused the renter, the sharecropper. And now it was the renter's chance to get even. And was perfectly happy to murder him. And that once one person started it, all of this anger at the landowners came out. Well, what Franco wanted to do was get rid of all that, was to tap that down, was to reimpose the old economic and social hierarchy with himself, not a king, himself at the top. And the Catholic Church in charge again. What about Japan? Well, conservatives in Japan wanted a Japanese empire and had wanted it since the 1880s. Once Japan began industrialization, we talked about this in part 1 of our class. Once Japan began industrialization, Japan itself does not have the resources for an industrialized society. So it has to get them from somewhere else. The problem with that is the world was divided up. And the easiest place to get the stuff was from China, was from northern China, was from Manchuria. And so, from almost the very beginning, from the decision really to industrialize the country, Japan was going to need an empire, just like the Europeans had. And so the conservatives wanted a Japanese empire. The problem was they also wanted economic independence from Europe and the European colonies. The Great Depression had really hurt Japan, and it kind of shown the weakness to being exposed to world finance. Almost all oil came from the United States or Indonesia, came from non-Japanese sources. Money, loans, infrastructure, steel came from other places. The Great Depression had just shown how vulnerable Japan was as the weakest of the great powers, or maybe they were better than Italy, so the second weakest of the great powers. And so the idea was independence, was to be free, was to not be dependent on anybody. So in 1937, they begin the conquest of China to steal its resources and to enslave its people. See, if you can own China and it's 600 million people, and you can enslave them and make them work for you, then you don't have to work so hard. Then you'll automatically have much, much, much more production because you'll have all of these Chinese people working for you. And you don't have to treat them very well because they're slaves. And this got infused into a racism and a terrorism versus Koreans and the Chinese that was already existing, that had already been picked up in the 19th century. And so this comes to its bloody climax, really, in what's called the Rape of Nanjing. Now, Nanjing was the second or third largest city. It was the traditional southern capital. It means southern capital. Beijing is the northern capital. Nanjing is the southern capital. And so it's a traditional capital. And the violence went on, the plundering and the violence went on for about a month or so, 2 months. And the estimates are that 200,000 Chinese people were dead and 20,000 people were raped. This act is so traumatizing, it still affects Japanese and Chinese relations today. Every time Japanese textbooks, history textbooks are written, Chinese authorities immediately go to the World War II Rape of Nanjing section to see if it's there and how it's talked about. And it was basically the idea that terrorism was this noble act. You were supposed to do this. It was okay to do this. The Chinese and the Koreans, because the Japanese will do a similar kind of genocidal violence in Korea during the war as well, was a noble act. It's the way it's supposed to be. That the Japanese war, or Japanese part of World War II, was to make East Asia, just like it was to make East Asia safe for the Japanese. Not just safe, but open, available for the Japanese to move into. Just like the Nazis had the idea of conquering Russia and then getting rid of all the Russians or enslaving the Russians so that German farmers, German industrialists could go east. That was the idea for the Japanese. That the Japan had the Japanese population. Japan was too small for the Japanese. And so they needed to expand. And the Chinese are losers, and the Koreans are losers, so why not just take their land? But China was too big to overwhelm. It's just too big, and you need oil, and you need coal, and you need minerals, and you need to make steel, and you need iron. And so it wasn't easy. It's just too big. So just like the German armies being sucked deeper and deeper into Russia, or into the Soviet Union, since it's also the Ukraine and the Caucasus Mountains, being sucked into the Soviet Union, Japan's armies continuously got sucked deeper and deeper into Asia, which meant it needed more resources. Those resources came from Southeast Asia and the European colonies. So it meant Japan would have to go to war against England and France and the Dutch. That waged a problem that the Philippine Islands, owned by the United States, was on the path between Japan and Southeast Asia. So they had to deal with the Americans in the Philippines. And by extension, Hawaii. Why? Because that's where the reinforcements will come from. They can't leave the Philippines in American hands. The Americans could at any point use an air force to sink ships, to sink trade ships, could send out their own navy, could at any point stop the supply lines from Southeast Asia to Japan, or the sending of reinforcements from Japan to Southeast Asia. So the Philippines was going to have to be dealt with. So the answer was to replay World War I. Why? Well, when was the last time Japan fought a European power, a white country that was bigger than them, richer than them, tougher than them, and won? Well, that was the war with Russia in 1904 and 1905. And how did they win? By a sneak attack on the Russian Navy, which paralyzed the Russian ability to do much of anything. And then when the Russians sent another navy for reinforcements to have a decisive naval battle, crush the Russian Navy, and win. So the sneak attack was at Port Arthur. The decisive naval battle was at Tsushima. And that allows for a negotiated victory in 1905. And so what did the Japanese do? A sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, the base where most of the American Navy was, and then a decisive naval battle. Now, whether or not the Japanese wanted to fight at Midway, I don't know, but that's the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was the decisive naval battle that was supposed to end the war by destroying what was left of the American Navy before a new Navy could be built. And so it played out exactly the same, except the United States won the Battle of Midway. And that's why when I was a youth, it was always called the turning point of the war. It's when the Americans started to win. It's only 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It's hardly Stalingrad, which was a year, 2 years into the war of the Soviet and German war. But that was the idea. They fought the war exactly like Russia, and it didn't work out. So what are the results of the Second World War? Well, it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. 60 million people dead, probably 4% of the world's population. In Japan, 67 Japanese cities were leveled by bombing. 60% or more destroyed. That means 60% of all the buildings leveled. By 1945, Japan was starving. China, eastern China, was completely leveled. Germany was occupied. Every major city was obliterated and divided. It was the weakest Germany had been since 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War. The UK was bankrupt and effectively broken. All of Churchill's speeches notwithstanding, he was voted out of office before the Second World War ended. At the Conference of Potsdam, where Stalin and Truman, because FDR had died of a brain aneurysm, Truman became president. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin were meeting, and Churchill was thrown out of office as prime minister. So he had to leave Potsdam. The UK would not end rationing of especially like meat and eggs until like 1954. Like, think about that. The 50s in the United States is one of plenty of a baby boom, of education, of the suburbs. In the UK, for half of it, you were still starving. You still did not have enough meat to feed the people. France was traumatized by defeat. How could we lose? How is that possible? And by the collaborators. And in 1945, 46, 47, especially the women. The women who had struck up relationships or had worked with or had been sexually active with German occupiers, they were attacked. So they became the face of punishing the collaborators more than the men who, the Vichy generals, they did not have their heads shaved like the women did. So France is completely traumatized, and there's a bit of France still hasn't dealt with the ramifications of the Second World War. There's a lot in French 20th century history that has been kind of papered over with the Algerian War is the same thing. The Algerian War is a trauma. I mean, I'm not a French historian, but I don't think the French society has quite known what to do with it. In a way, us Americans haven't really dealt with Vietnam. There was a period in the 70s when we were working through the trauma, and then in the 80s we said, F it. The government sold out the soldiers, and we should have won, and the Rambo and the platoons and the Full Metal Jacket and the yah yah rah rah, and so there's still a lot of trauma in the Vietnam War that we haven't worked through. Italy was occupied. Mussolini was violently murdered, was violently killed. The USA was the richest country in the world and had the atomic bomb. The USSR was the strongest army in the world, but also had 20 million dead. The United States had 400,000 dead, which is not nothing. It's a lot. The USSR had 20 million dead. So the Soviet army ends up in Berlin, raising the Soviet flag, and the United States Army at Nuremberg. The anti-fascists blew up the giant swastika at the Nuremberg Pavilion, where the Nazi night marches that were made so famous in Triumph of the Will occurred. So if you ever want to know what an anti-fascist looks like, just go ask Grandpa, because there it was. Whether you were a Soviet grandpapa or an American grandpapa, you were anti-fascist. What did the Shoah Holocaust prove about Zionism? I highly, highly recommend that if you ever get the chance, take a class on the Holocaust. Take a chance on this period, on Jewish history in this period. It is too big of a topic for us to deal with, and it's too hard. I just don't have the emotional energy to do it. And it is a trauma that the world and Judaism is still dealing with. The role of the Pope in it, the role of, did the Americans know? Should we have bombed railroads? There is still, 80, 90 years later, a lot of trauma involved. So I have to start with why the Shoah and the Holocaust, because most of you will only know it as the Holocaust. But when historiography, when people, so this event happened, and it didn't have a name. It was just the murdering of the Jews, which is what the Nazis called it. And nobody wants to name it what the Nazis called it. So there needed to be another name. And the first name that kind of was used was Shoah, catastrophe. That this thing had happened to us. And there's a lot of sources that are basically in the 40s and the 50s, people who had suffered in the Shoah didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to move on. That this horror had happened to them. And that they needed to move on. There was the question of any trauma. How did this happen? And you have your collaborationists, Jews who worked with the Nazis. We were sold out by other people. That's the Dutch. So we have Anne Frank as one of our pictures. We have the Poles who worked and helped build Auschwitz, the Catholic Poles. So you have collaborators. There's also the idea that Jews were weak. The idea is that we allowed this to happen to us. And you'll see this in kind of more conservative circles today with that like to use the Holocaust as kind of like why we should have guns and why we should be able to use violence against the government. It's like, well, look at what happened to the Jews. They didn't fight back. And there's all this masculine stuff about it. But in the earliest days of the Shoah, it was like, how did this happen? And how did we allow it to happen? How were we marched onto the trains? And how were we then marched onto these lines? And how were we then put into the gas chambers? And how is it possible? Because for the people many of the people who survived, especially in the United States or in Western Europe, it was, how? How would you allow this to happen? Why don't you fight back? And so the Shoah, the catastrophe, was this traumatic grief of trying to understand this horror. But by the 1960s, it was the historiography and the memory of it was changing. The generation was changing. And it was becoming the Holocaust, the burnt sacrifice. The Holocaust is a burned sacrifice. I don't know if it's the first time it's mentioned in the Old Testament, but it's Abraham and Isaac. The idea that Abraham is supposed to sacrifice Isaac, his second-born son, but his first legitimate-born son from his wife. And actually, Isaac carries the wood up for the Holocaust. So it's the idea that you do a sacrifice and then you burn the offering. And Abraham's going to do this with Isaac, and then the angel Gabriel comes and stops him, and then there's a ram, and him and Isaac sacrifice the ram. The idea was what Yahweh wanted was proof that you would do what Yahweh asked you to do. But what a Holocaust is a sacrifice. And so that became, and that's now the name that's used today. No, very few people will call it the Shoah. You'll very rarely see it in the historiography. So it gets replaced. And part of the Holocaust is this anger. Not only this trauma, but it's a new generation. It's like, this happened to us. The state did this to us. Look at all the machines that did this. Look at all the people involved. And it's a way of saying, it's a way of turning it from this happened to us to you did this to us. And we're going to shame you and we're going to hold you accountable. And if you're Eichmann trying to hide out in Chile, and not Chile, in Argentina, or you're some of the other Nazis who are hiding out in Brazil and Chile and in the Middle East, we're going to find you. We're going to get you. We're going to arrest you. We're going to bring you back, and we're going to hold you accountable. And so we use the Holocaust today. But it's important to know that there was this change in how one thought about it and how the different generations thought about it. And what we see is 55% of Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. Some 6 million or so. But those numbers, those averages, don't get at what happened. In Greece, 86% of Jews were murdered. In Hungary, 75%. In the Netherlands and the Dutch, 75%. In Lithuania, 88%. In Poland, 87%. In Yugoslavia, 90%. In France that was fighting against the Germans. France, liberal, Paris, the most liberal place on earth, 30%. So what did the Shoah Holocaust prove about Zionism? It proved it was right. The 1871 Dreyfus Affair that brought the original Zionists together to meet and discuss what should we do had the argument that if liberal France was anti-Semitic, then no place would be safe for us. We needed a homeland, a country run by Jews, dedicated to protecting Jews. Now, originally, Zionists were willing to go anywhere. Any country would be fine. And so there was arguments about Madagascar or arguments about a part of Kenya. But ultimately, it was, we must go back to where we came from. You can't separate the people from the soil. We came from Palestine. We came from Judea. We came from Israel. We must go back there. And we must make it into a new Jewish homeland. Now, in part 3, we'll talk about this, and one of the problems with that is that there are other people living there. Well, Moses dealt with the same problem. So there is at least historical analogies for dealing with that problem. But the idea of Zionism was, it was right. The Holocaust, the Shoah, proved that if it wasn't safe in France in the 1870s, it wasn't safe anywhere. So you have Elie Wiesel saying, we must always take sides, that neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. The idea that it's not my problem, that the response to the people who say, I didn't turn anybody in, I didn't hurt anybody, I didn't say anything. The Nazis did things. And they say, but you didn't speak out against it. You may not have been pro-fascist, but you weren't anti-fascist either. And that only helps the oppressor. If you're watching the video, there are 3 images on the right from Schindler's List. And the first is from the ending of the movie when the camp in Czechoslovakia is liberated, when the Schindler camp factory is liberated by the Russians, by the Soviet Union general, Soviet Union troops, and he comes in on his horse. And the leader of the group stands up and he goes, have you been in Poland? And he says, I just came from Poland. He goes, are there any Jews left? And essentially there weren't. 87% were destroyed in the Holocaust. An entire culture ripped up. Then there's the second 2 images. And they come also from Schindler's List, and they come from the section which is the liquidation of the ghetto, the destruction of the ghetto. And so this section is begun by the commandant, who gives a big speech about history, and that the Jews were welcomed in back in the day, and they have thrived, and they have been here, and that we are ending tonight, that we are going to destroy the Jewish life in the ghetto, it was the ghetto, but it's in Warsaw. They had been pushed into what was called the ghetto. And we are going to destroy that. And so that history never existed. That when they look at the books and they say, there was a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, that the kids will go, what ghetto? What Jews? That they couldn't have existed any, because there are none. We are going to clean history up. If you want revanchist, That's revanchist. And so it's a very violent episode that happens. And the soundtrack is this piano piece. As people are being murdered, as people being found, as people being rounded up, there's this piano piece, very fast piano piece. And I always show this in my I used to always show this when I did World War II history classes. And we have a GIF of it. And the reason why is he's playing this young, Aryan, slicked back hair, SS officer is playing a piece. He clearly is a concert pianist. He is clearly trained, not as a murderer. He's not a thug. He is this concert pianist. He is educated. He is artistic. He is trained. He is polished. And he's also a Nazi. And he's also an SS officer. And then two guys come in who have been murdering people. And they have a debate. Is it Bach? Is it Bach? No. It's Mozart. Well, it's Bach's English Suite No. 2. But what is that supposed to be? They're arguing about classical music. Is it Bach or is it Mozart? Right? German composers, yes. So, he's not doing jazz. But it means they also have to know what classical music sounds like, what Mozart sounds like, what Bach sounds like. For them to have this debate, they also have to be educated. They don't go, what are you playing? They go, what is it? Is it Bach? No, it's Mozart. It's not Mozart. It turns out to be Bach's English Suite No. 2, which is an interesting piece to pick because it's called the English Suite. Why tell you about this? Why show this? It's the idea that the Nazis weren't malevolent people at the beginning. Nazism turned people into malevolent beings. I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but it's none of these people needed to be Nazis murdering Jews. None of them. They didn't start out that way. They weren't born that way. They became that. The system created that. These three guys should be doing something else. That this pianist's talent is completely wasted by being an SS officer. The education of the other guys is wasted. These are not dumb hicks from stupid land. I mean, that's the thing, is the Nazi regime turned people into this with its hatred. That's what fascism does. It creates violence, creates hatreds, creates murderers. This is part of my own history. My great-grandmother was German. She was a German emigre to the United States before the First World War. She had 3 or 4 sons who went off to fight in the Second World War. She had 14 children, by the way. And one of my uncles, well, my grandfather turned out to end up being a guard at Nuremberg. He spoke, because his parents were recent immigrants and didn't really learn English, he natively spoke German and Hungarian, which are 2 languages that are very different. You don't learn both of those unless you have to. And he would end up being a guard at Nuremberg. at the trials after of the Nazis, so that as a guard he was tasked, at least this is family history, this is family stories. He was tasked with listening in on the Germans talking, and then reporting back their conversations to his superiors. But I had another uncle, Uncle Jimmy, great Uncle Jimmy, who liberated a couple of the camps along with Patton's Third Army, I think it was. It's been a while since I've had to remember this and tell the story, but I think it's the Patton's Third Army, Birkenwald, the ones in southern and western Germany. And he liberated the camps, and the story is that he came back, he was not the same. He was not the same boy who went. He was definitely different. And my great-grandmother didn't believe the Holocaust happened. She denied. She was a Holocaust denier. And she said, no. The Germans I knew would not do such a thing. Germans are a good people. We are a cultured people. She could not rectify the German culture she knew, that she was a part of, that she had left to become an American, but had left with what her son had seen, had taken photos of, had told her had happened. What are two sons? What are all of her sons? Because they would all be at the Holocaust camps, the murder camps, at some point. And she wouldn't believe it. She denied it to her death. And that was a way for her not to be traumatized, I think. For her not to be part of it. Because if the Germans could do this, could she have done it? Would she have been okay with it? Would her family have been okay with it? Instead of her sons fighting against it. And if you don't like those questions, then you say it can't happen. It couldn't have happened. It's not real. But it was real. So that's part of my own history. My grandfather was at Nuremberg as a guard, as a spy. He didn't come home for a while. He didn't come home with the rest of the soldiers. My grandfather was also in the Bulge, in the Battle of the Bulge. So, very, very Saving Private Ryan, who had run into one of his other brothers or his brother-in-law in Germany when one of the armies that the other one was with rescued his army during the Bulge, and they ran into each other. At least that's family story. I have no historical documents to collaborate that, but that was always the story. That somewhere in the Ardennes or western Germany, they finally ran into each other after years of being apart. But what makes the Holocaust different? Because I've talked about genocide all throughout my 101 course and my 102 courses. We started with the genocide of the Native Americans, the obliteration of African cultures in slavery. We talked about the destruction of Jews before against the Assyrians and against the Romans, the Babylonian captivity. We talked about the destruction of Carthage. The Carthaginians are destroyed by the Romans. But the Shoah, the Holocaust as it's later known, was different. And it's different because it was the systematic search for and attempted destruction of an entire ethnic group for the very fact of being an ethnic group. That it was an industrialized scientific genocide, which was new. What the Assyrians did was a genocide. But what the Romans did was pick up people and scatter them. The idea being that they would marry in, that they would become Assyrian. They would become Roman. That if you married them into the majority group, they would disappear because they would become the majority culture. This is different from that. Even if the result might be the same, this is a systematic search for. This is Christoph Waltz at the start of Inglourious Bastards with his conversation of taking all of that time. What is it? 3, 4, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes of conversation to logically, proceedingly find these hidden Jews. There was no reason to go after Anne Frank. None. Absolutely none. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was a little girl. The destruction of Anne Frank becomes so important, becomes kind of the thing that pops out of the 6 million names because it didn't have to happen. There's no military reason. There's no cultural reason it had to happen. It happened because the Holocaust was different. So what was the Cold War? The Cold War, in its definition, is an ideological conflict, short of military conflict, between capitalist and communist economic and political systems between 1945 and 1989. That's what it was. What was it in actuality? Beyond the definition, it was a traumatized USSR against a fearful United States. The USSR was traumatized by the First World War, the Russian Civil War, and the invasion by the Nazis of World War II. It feared being attacked by the Western Europeans and American alliance, and the idea was from the beginning it needed an empire and communist allies to protect it. So what does it do? It installs communist dictators, and we use that in quotes because they weren't really communist in any definition of communism. They were just allied to the Soviet Union, to its autocracy. But they were dictators in Eastern Europe and began to ferment revolution in capitalist places elsewhere, whether it was supporting communist parties or arming rebels in the colonies. For the United States, it was the fear of the Soviet desire to overthrow the democratic capitalist governments. See, the Soviet Union believed in its philosophy. That's why it's not just Stalin who's the paranoid one, but it's philosophical from the beginning is the West is out to get us. Western Europe and the Americans are out to get us. So we have to go on the offense. We have to undermine Western Europe and the Americans to make life safer for us, which is rational if you think if the West is actually trying to undermine you. It's the idea that the paranoid, you're not paranoid if people are actually out to get you. You know, the paranoid person may not always be wrong. Like you may think everyone's out to get you, but what if they are? Well, the U.S. feared the Soviet desire to overthrow the democratic capitalist governments and run the world, even if it was to, quote, protect itself, quote, quote, quote. It's the idea that America had to have its own, quote, empire. We're not really going to own France and the Netherlands and Norway and the UK and Australia because it's going to be an empire of democracy. So, but the United States was going to have to be the policeman of the world. The United States was going to be the leader of NATO. The United States was going to have an empire of democracy that it had to protect. And so we see that in the Marshall Plan. So the Soviet Union installs governments in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Bulgaria. The United States bribes governments to rebuild a capitalist Europe with money and lots of stuff. Steel and railroads and engines and lots of stuff. And this is why the boomers, everyone's been talking about how America is on decline. But the United States, remember, the United States today is the second largest industrial power in the world after China. But in 1950, the United States made 60% of the world's economic goods. One country made 60% of the world's industrial goods. You can only go down from there. The United States has 5% of the world's population. And only 25% of that population was in manufacturing. So the United States should have somewhere between 2 to 5% of the world's manufacturing if all things are equal. We had 60%. So no wonder everyone, the boomers and politicians, are always decrying, "Oh, what life used to be." Well, it was unnatural for the United States to be so powerful in 1950. It shouldn't have been that way. It was the First World War, it was the Second World War that had caused that. But the Marshall Plan was this idea that we'll bribe France, we'll bribe Britain, we'll bribe the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians and Western Germany to rebuild so that they'll be capitalist. What did the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happens in 1961? 62? It's October 62? But what does it prove? So it's during Kennedy. And what did the Cuban Missile Crisis prove about the Cold War? And what it proved is the U.S. and the Soviet troops can never shoot at each other. And I say this just as a Russian plane downed a U.S. drone over the Black Sea during the Ukrainian war. So if you're listening to this in the far future, this is happening in March 2023. I hope you're okay. I hope nothing bad happens. But the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, early 1960s, proved that shouldn't happen. That the U.S. and the Soviet Union should not be shooting at each other. Because nuclear weapons, especially the hydrogen bomb, equals the end of civilization. And we see this with the wonderful 1980s movie War Games, in which the computer decides when to shoot the missiles, and what it does is destroy the entire universe. So it's winner, none, winner, none. It goes through all of these scenarios of every kind of nuclear war, and everybody loses. The nuclear weapons and the hydrogen bomb equals the end of civilization. The Tsar bomb, the largest bomb ever test exploded, if it was dropped on Philadelphia, would lead to 2.35 million deaths. Every building would be leveled from City Hall to Haddonfield. The fallout cancers from fallout radiation, would go from Princeton to Hamilton. You can't have that. You just can't. No politician can have that. There's no way to win. And occasionally I'll get into fights with people on Twitter where they're like, you could win a nuclear war. No, you can't. You cannot win a nuclear war. For a long time in the 50s and the 60s, maybe even to the early 70s, there was the idea that you might be able to win the nuclear war. And they're like, how? And I saw a government book once that was like, winning the nuclear war. And it went through like, well, 90% of hospitals in Denver will be destroyed. So this is what we need to do. We have to build out triage clinics. And you go, well, that's going to cost billions of dollars to have clinics that you're not using, but have to exist in case nuclear war happens. So since you can't nuke each other, how do you compete? How does the Soviet Union and the United States compete? And we'll talk about this more when we hit kind of the 50s, 60s, and the Cold War in part 3. But it was competition by other means. Culture and sports and economics and the space race. Notice it's not the space war. It's a space race. First to put the first human in space. The Soviet Union wins that. But then Kennedy goes, we're going to go to the moon. Like, we've already lost the first human in space, but we're going to go to the moon. And there's a new race. We just changed the rules. So we had lost the first race. So we lost the first race to space. We lost the first race to put a human into space. So then it became, well, we'll go to the moon. We'll land somebody on the moon and get them off. Now, when Kennedy said that, nobody thought it was possible. And he said, by the end of the decade, by like literally 1970, in 10 years. And like, that wasn't feasible when Kennedy said those words. They made it feasible with a lot of money and a lot of brain power and a lot of industrialization. But if you read the first few chapters of The Right Stuff, like the American space program was a mess and became awesome. But that's the Olympics. Every sport where the Americans and Soviet athletes competed against each other became synonymous with which system is better, in the individualism of America or the professionalism, communalism of the Soviet Union. So we're going to talk more about that. We have finished part 2. Congratulations, everybody. We finished on a bit of a downer note with the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, the Second World War. And so what I'm leaving you with is something that makes everybody feel better. And that is Keanu Reeves saying, "Puppies." I know I only have the GIF of it, but really, you got to go find this interview where it's a John Wick interview from the first John Wick movie where they put a bunch of puppies with Keanu, and Keanu he says "puppies," and I'll give you, it is pretty cute. Not as cute as our puppies in our last slide, and they are adorable little cute puppies. So what does Keanu say? He says puppies. And we got the cutest cutes around. So maybe that will make you feel better. I hope it makes you feel better. I'm totally sorry for being a downer, but that's what happens when we do World War II. So anyway, take care, be safe, and I'll see you in part 3 of the course.